he's caught in a contradiction and he doesn't know what to do. And these contradictions are now going to come very quickly. I'll give you a couple more examples. He wants to have tariffs. But tariffs is already a contradiction because the entire history of the Republican Party has been the anti-tax party. For a century, that's all every election, we won't tax you, we won't raise you, we'll lower the taxes. What? We will lower it's endless. Well, a tariff, for those who may not be clear, is a tax. A tariff is simply the name of a particular tax, a tax imposed when an object produced outside the United States comes in to the United States. When it crosses the border, it is required to pay to the U.S. government a tax, which is called a tariff. Another word for it is an import duty. There is clear what it means. So when Mr. Trump, in both of his elections, said, I'm going to hit the Chinese with a tariff, it shows that he doesn't understand economics, not even on the most simple level. He actually thought, because he kept saying it, that the tariff would be paid by China. But it isn't. It's paid by an American importer. And what the American importer is almost always likely to do is to raise the final price of the object in order to recover at least part of the duty paid to Uncle Sam. So it's a tax. And because it is so big, and because it is against Mr. Trump, Mexico and Canada, the two major trading partners of the United States, and China, the biggest power other than the United States in the world today, economically speaking, nobody else is close. This is a massive program of taxation. And one of the effects it'll have is to worsen the inflation in the United States. But it is opposition to inflation that enabled Mr. Trump to win the election. He was able to blame Biden and, by definition, Kamala Harris for the inflation. So how is he going to manage the contradiction between being the champion of higher tariffs on the one hand, and the opponent and enemy of inflation? Can't be done. Cannot be. So the question is, how is he going to resolve it? Just like it can't be done that you can get rid of all the immigrants without putting Tesla and the whole of the American apparatus. We have developed our high tech in California and elsewhere heavily reliant on an army of engineers and technicians that come from other parts of the world, particularly Asia, but not only Asia, all over, with more and more development based on all of that. And when you think of the remittances and you think of what might happen to these countries if these people have to go back home because they either don't have the documents or, as has been threatened, they may be required to lose their jobs, in which case they can't stay here anyway. You know, even if they are citizens, how are they going to stay? They can't get the job for which they are trained. What are they going to do? Become greeters at Walmart? I mean, we can't find enough jobs for the people we have in this country. We have serious unemployment. We just announced 1 million people homeless in the country. You know, this supposedly rich country. So these are contradictions, and I could go on. If you want, I will go on. I'll give you other examples of these contradictions. This doesn't work. And the question is, how is he going to navigate if he goes one way or the other? For example, going with Elon Musk and Ramaswamy and the others to let HB1 come through. Okay, then he's resolved that contradiction. But he has split his own MAGA movement. He has disappointed millions of people who will now be telling each other he's another traitor, like Bush, like Clinton. He can't afford that. The minute he looks like them, he's finished. because he was acceptable as a man who rapes women. He was convicted of that. As a man who has, 8 businesses that went bankrupt because he failed. All of the things people know about him were acceptable because he was something new and different. If he's not new and different, then these other things are going to come back to haunt him politically. This is impossible. And there's no sign, I look for these things, there's no sign of how he's going to get out of this. Just like there are no signs that the American economy is going to emerge from its current crisis, or that the American empire will do anything other than continue to disintegrate, which puts pressures on him that are greater than have been on any president for a century. The United States empire is about a century old. The British Empire collapsed in the early part of the 20th century. The American empire is collapsing in the early part of the 21st century. And this has to be, the contradictions emerging from that are staggering. They make this issue of the visas, yes or no for HB1 versus your average poor immigrant, that looks like a small story relative to the enormous story that's coming down. But it is similar in the sense that it's a contradiction that they don't even understand what their problem is most of the time. In this case, they actually they understand, oh yes, we can't be anti-immigrant, but we must be anti-immigrant, but we can't be. They get that little one, but the bigger one, they pretend it isn't there.
The Financial Times, I think it was yesterday, wrote a long kind of column on some of the possibilities of the trade war, or a post-WTO based consensus world where tariffs come up again, and maybe countries lapse into national economies and so on and so forth. And they laid out like 5 or 4 possibilities, but effectively these were 2. And I wanted to have your thoughts on them. One of the possibilities they discussed was that the United States would fail in this trade war. China and others would integrate even more strongly. Even the European Union would look for Chinese electric vehicles and other ways to build stronger relations. Recently, I read about Nigeria and Chinese currency swap of about $2 billion, which means that some kind of bilateral agreement helps them to trade even more strongly. There is much more Chinese engagement in Central America and Latin America. And the United States, facing the brunt of inflation because of what you just described, would slow down even more. So that's one kind of possibility. The other possibility, they said, is where the United States is successful, and that goes like this. It says that China faces slowdown, unable to export and continue its export-led strategy, and it's being unable to sort of retransition into domestic-led growth, and the United States being able to drive up its capital market, meaning to suck in all the capital back and to make a Silicon Valley-based high-tech-led growth model, which might be devastating for its working class, but it would keep the American hegemony floating. What's your impression of the other model, given you have been speaking for a while about the collapse of the American imperialism?
Well, I think the other one, let me take a step back. Again, the history. The Financial Times, The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, all the major places people go for, let's call it global economic analysis. They have a problem. They have inherited a problem, which is their own fault. They have assumed that the dominance of the United States that was real in the 20th century, certainly after the First World War, even more certainly after the Great Depression, and completely certain after World War II. So starting 1945 latest, you have had more than half a century of absolute dominance by the United States. Dominance militarily, economically, politically, ideologically, extraordinary, extraordinary. Culminating in the implosion of the Soviet Union, 1989, and the end of Eastern Europe and all of that. This has led to an inability to recognize the limits, because when they thought there might be limits, they weren't. The Soviet Union had an atomic bomb shortly after the end of World War II. In other words, they answered Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they were never a threat to the United States. It was silly. And they thought it was. They were so horrified that another country could have nuclear weapons, especially one that was hostile. And then they learned over the whole period of the second half of the 20th century that the Soviet Union was not a major problem. It did not inhibit or block the dominance of the United States. They said so to justify the military, but nobody was fooled. And if you're an economist, it made no sense at all.
Right.
All right. You know, I try to teach people who don't know it that, you know, the GDP of Russia today, which is bigger than what it was under the Soviet Union, is, I don't know, $3 trillion, maybe
Maybe
four.
even less. Maybe even
Or
less.
less. 2.5.
Yeah.
And that of the United States is under 28, 29 trillion dollars. So what are you talking? Wait, what? This is silly. There's no threat here. They have weapons. I get that. They have weapons, but they don't. Everybody knows that your ability to wield the military depends on your economic. I mean, stop. What is this? And so then you had an arms race, which was the way to show the world and Russia, you can't keep up with us. Mm-hmm. We're spending, you know, the expenditures on military by the United States are equal to the next 10 countries, which include Russia and China, you know, and the rest are all allies of the United States anyway. So this is childish. And you can understand how you would get the notion that this is a level of dominance. You know, I don't even mention 750 military bases around the world, ringing Russia, ringing China. I mean, the 7th Fleet is over there. There's no Chinese fleet here. I mean, unless you're crazy and living in the bubble of American anti-communism, in there, they're frightened, though. That's important. But anybody else, you know. I remember many years ago, there was a foreign minister in India named Krishna Menon.
Yeah.
Brilliant man. And it was the first time I understood how it looks from there. Mm-hmm. The guy they have now is very impressive, too.
Jaishankar.
Yeah, he's very good. And he's not quick to be intimidated. The press goes after him, he comes right back. Very good. Anyway, unusual. The Indians, there weren't that many willing to do that. So in this period of dominance of the United States, here's the problem. You don't see as it begins to shrink, as it begins to crumble. You just don't see it. And I'll give you an example. All those things, when 10 years ago, for the first time, we heard the word BRICS, right? They made fun of it. Oh, look at these. Big mistake. Even now, they don't take it seriously. It's 9 countries, 9 partners, 4 more countries about to become partners, and at least a dozen more waiting. What are you talking about? This is half the population of the planet. The United States has 4.5% of the world's people. You can't pretend that this is not a difference here. So my answer to the 2 stories you laid out is too late. This is a story, this is not about what can happen. This is about teaching their audience that we're in trouble. we have two ways we can go. This is the one that it looks like, but this is the one we can hope for. The second one is pure hope. It's not really, it could go, it could go. The whole thrust of the world now is BRICS, not the United States. Let me give you just a simple example, which they will almost never talk about. I won't bore you with how many times, because I read all these things every day, as I guess you do. So I read these things. Here's what I read. The United States has the fastest growing economy in the developed world. That's not true. Why are you putting that in your newspaper? The International Monetary Fund, which is a Western organization, keeps track of economic growth. The economic growth of 2024, of which there are only 2 days left, right? So we know what it'll be. United States, 2.8% growth GDP. Every other member of the G7, less than that.
Right.
Germany, zero or negative recession. What is it in Russia, the enemy in Ukraine? 3.5%. So Russia is growing faster. Russia!
But Russia is not developed in their internal
How
view.
convenient. Then
Right.
let's go to China. Is China developed? Also not.
Not in their view. It's
Yes,
not part of the developed nations.
China's development for the last 30
Right.
years. China this year, IMF, 4.8. That's
Right.
almost double.
Almost
India, 7%. That's what IMF says. Okay? So India, Russia, and China, the three major BRICS economies, are all growing much faster. What do you think? By the way, that's not new for China. That's been true for 30 years. That's why the Chinese now have the second biggest economy in the world, which, depending on how you count, will become the biggest by the end of this decade. So, it's too late. It's clear what's going to happen. Let me finish. I don't think the United States has a future at this point. It's not a question of coming up with clever ideas of what might happen. If you ask me, is it possible, this second story? Yes, it's possible. But I only say that for the same reason that I will say nobody can predict the future. There are too many variables and there's too many uncertainties. So is it possible? Yes. But I don't think it's there to sketch a possible road. I think it's there as part of the slow and painful re-education of the American capitalist class that the empire is finished. And they have to come to terms with it.